very best thing that I can do right now is to read to you the opening paragraphs of The Healers, a novel by Ayi Kwei Armah. It starts out like this. In the 20th year of his life, a young man found himself at the center of strange, extraordinary events. Someone was murdered, a youth exactly the same age as himself. The killing was done in a particularly bloody, brutal way. Those who saw the victim's body agreed on one thing. The murderer acted from a fierce, passionate motive, the kind of violent motive springing out of jealousy made hotter by pure vindictive hate. It seemed there were no living witnesses to the murder. The victim was the heir in the house of power at Esawano, a prince named Apia. Those in a position to know said he was destined to inherit not only old power, but, far more important, the possibility of fantastic wealth. I've never read a novel by Armah before, and The Healers, originally published in 1978, is not his most famous one. But when I read these first paragraphs, I could tell that I was in the hands of a master storyteller, somebody who's not afraid to take a bold narrative voice, a narrative voice that takes a stance, while at the same time, somebody who is very attentive to the importance of story and to the importance of a drama that carries through the text. And I loved this. I was completely ready for this. I was ready to just sink into this, to be a listener, to hear this sweeping story. And it is a sweeping story. Here's what's going on. This is set in the late 19th century in West Africa, mostly in the area that would be more or less known as Ghana. Our primary character is a young man named Densu, about 20 years old, and he is living in this village called Esawano, which was mentioned in the first paragraphs. And what is happening in Esawano is a few different things. The community is very caught up, first of all, as always, with their own personal dramas and rivalries and cares. There's also the habit of conflict with communities who have been their longtime neighbors, other ethnic groups. And there's also white people. And this is at a particularly interesting point because while white people have been a presence, especially on the coasts of Africa for hundreds of years, trading, selling, stealing people as slaves that they took elsewhere, this is right at the point in time when Europe's powers basically got together, took a map, and marked out who would control what. This is the beginning of the big scramble for Africa and of the very start of fever pitch colonialism. So this is a drive in the novel that the characters are feeling, sensing, aware of, alert to, but really have no sense of the scope of yet. It hasn't quite taken shape yet. It still feels like it's something in the background. In one of the scenes that opens the novel, the community of Esawano is caught up in an annual tradition of a sort of like Olympic Games. The community's young men spend a week competing with each other in different contests of sport and skill and athleticism. Densu participates in this. Now he is one of the strongest and most skillful members of the community, but he is very conflicted about participating in these games, in part because on one hand he wants to be he's hungry for community, and he has a natural love for things like running and swimming and just engaging in the natural landscape and feeling his body move. But what he doesn't like is competition as competition, that the point of these things is to be better than someone else. He feels a deep loathing of this, and generally we see him emerge as a bright center of the community, but also a real oddball, according to everyone else. What Denso really wants to be is a healer. Now, his mentor is a healer named Damfu, who lives in the eastern part of the forest and has had, a friendship with Densu for some time. And Densu finally decides he wants to go commit to being a healer, go to Demfu, stay there, learn what he needs to do. A few different things come up. This murder that we see in the first opening pages, Densu ends up being framed for it. And as a fugitive in a community of healers that he travels to with Demfu and Demfu's young daughter Ajoa, who is of course our romantic interest here, we gradually begin to see that this healing work is not just about helping people feel healthier or helping people feel less stressed, although there's that. The healers have a broader view. They have this view of a sort of Pan-African wholeness, this core spirituality that unites people, especially people native to the African continent, to one another. They feel that this core sickness that people are dealing with is fragmentation, the fragmentation that has put people into different towns and tribes and communities and feeling like they're apart from one another, and that this fragmentation is ultimate weakness that is able, of course, to be exploited by these looming colonizers. Now, in a lot of ways, I gotta say, the Healers reminds me of the Brothers Karamazov. Don't laugh at me when I say that. Dentsu is our Alyosha character, this seeking moral center. Danfu is, of course, our Zosima character, the spiritual mentor. A murder mystery in both of these novels is the propeller that moves us through a story that is much broader and bigger in scope and intent and ultimate meaning. And another thing that the two novels have in common is that I love them both. The Healers is really good. What really amazes me is how Armah is able to straddle these two worlds of being a storyteller of broad vision without losing sight of the necessity for having, very specific things happening, have a drama that us as readers are able to follow through and even get excited to find out what happens and how is this going to be resolved. I mean, for God's sake, there's a murder, and this isn't by any means the only death that we see in the book. The way he's able to balance both of those without feeling like either the broad storytelling strategy or the specific storytelling strategy is merely a device leveraged to enhance the other. The way that he's able to hold these both at the same time is what ultimately makes this novel work. It's also paced in a really interesting way. White space in this novel isn't used how I'm accustomed to seeing white space in fiction being used. It's not, in fact, almost never signifies a gap in time. It has other significances and a changing significance from time to time. It's not just, used for emphasis either. It gives a sense of movement through the text, even when we're in one of the more slower, more patient narrative points of the book. This was really interesting for me to experience as a reader, and in effect, the white space felt like handholds to move through a novel that was told in a way that felt both familiar and unfamiliar to me in a lot of ways, but definitely had my interest. I also want to point out that while this is a moral book in a lot of ways, while there's a strong moral vision carried through by the author, the storyteller, and especially our healers, it doesn't feel like a message book. It doesn't feel like it's a device that's supposed to make us conclude one particular, I don't know, political position or something like that. And this gives the book a bit of space. It gives it an airiness that emphasizes the fact that this is a story first, and that's really important for this to be a novel that I could love. If I were to critique anything about it, I would just suggest making the moral dilemma a little bit more challenging. While it's not resolved neatly, it is pretty apparent who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, very early on. I would have appreciated that to be complicated a little bit more. Ultimately, I felt this was a beautiful book full of patient storytelling and strong vision. And while this is the first Armah book I've read, it won't be the last, even though I have, in my investigations, discovered that Armah's novels aren't as easy to find these days as they should be. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this in this particular review, is because they should be available. You should get a chance to read this. This is an author who deserves attention, these are not books of just a particular time and place. These are books, at least this book, is one that lasts.